I was born long before anyone called this place America. Before there were towering cities, highways stretching beyond the horizon, or flags waving over government buildings, I knew only endless forests, roaring rivers, towering mountains, and skies that seemed to stretch forever. My heartbeat echoed through lands that had already been home to millions of people for thousands of years. I watched nations rise without castles, civilizations flourish without kings, and cultures grow deep roots into the soil long before unfamiliar ships appeared on my distant horizon. Everything felt eternal. At least, that's what I believed. I had no way of knowing that strange sails would soon emerge from the ocean, carrying dreams, fear, ambition, and conflict that would reshape everything I had ever known. That moment was still coming. For centuries before it arrived, life moved with the rhythm of nature. I watched hunters follow buffalo across endless plains. I listened to songs carried through forests where sunlight filtered between ancient trees. Communities traded across vast distances, built remarkable cities, cultivated crops, and passed wisdom from one generation to the next. This land was never empty. It was alive. Every valley carried stories. Every river remembered footsteps. Every mountain had already witnessed countless generations before history books would begin telling my story. Then, whispers started traveling across the Atlantic. European kingdoms hungered for wealth, new trade routes, and territories they had never seen. Explorers believed unimaginable riches waited beyond the horizon. They weren't simply looking for new lands. They were searching for opportunity. And eventually, they found me. In 1492, unfamiliar ships crossed an ocean that had protected my shores for thousands of years. Their arrival marked the beginning of a transformation so enormous that even I could not understand its consequences. At first, these encounters were filled with curiosity. Different languages echoed through unfamiliar landscapes. Strange foods, tools, and customs were exchanged. But curiosity never remained alone. Disease arrived, conflict followed. Entire communities that had thrived for generations suddenly faced invisible enemies they couldn't fight. Villages became silent. Traditions that had survived for centuries were threatened almost overnight. The land itself seemed to mourn as populations declined at unimaginable speed. Yet the arrivals kept coming. Spanish settlements expanded across the south and west. French traders explored enormous river systems. Dutch merchants established trading posts. The English looked toward permanent colonies, believing they could build entirely new lives across the ocean. Each group carried different dreams, but they all wanted something from me. Then came Jamestown. In 1607, the English established their first permanent settlement. It sounded like the beginning of success, but survival proved far more difficult than anyone expected. Hunger stalked every season. Disease spread relentlessly. Harsh winters claimed lives before dreams could become reality. Many wondered whether the colony would disappear entirely. For a while, it almost did. The settlers searched desperately for something valuable enough to justify staying. Gold never appeared in the quantities they imagined. Instead, another crop quietly began changing everything: tobacco. Almost overnight, the colony discovered an economic engine powerful enough to attract thousands of newcomers. Investors celebrated. Ships crossed the Atlantic carrying supplies, families, workers, and hope. But prosperity came with a terrible price. As plantations expanded, the demand for labor exploded. At first, many workers arrived as indentured servants, agreeing to years of labor in exchange for passage across the ocean. Yet that system gradually shifted towards something far darker. In 1619, another ship arrived. Its passengers had not chosen the journey. They were Africans, captured and forced across the Atlantic in brutal conditions that would become part of one of history's greatest human tragedies. Their arrival marked the beginning of centuries of slavery that would shape every chapter of my future. The foundations of wealth and freedom were now becoming intertwined with unimaginable suffering. That contradiction would never truly disappear. Not then. Not for generations. Still, more colonies emerged. Families crossed dangerous seas seeking religious freedom, economic opportunity, or simply another chance at life. Small settlements slowly transformed into growing towns. Churches rose beside marketplaces. Farms stretched farther inland. Roads connected communities that only years earlier had been isolated clearings in dense wilderness. The 13 colonies were beginning to take shape. From the outside, they appeared united. But beneath the surface, different beliefs, competing economies, and conflicting visions were already pulling them apart. Some believed loyalty to the English crown guaranteed stability. Others quietly began asking dangerous questions. Who should truly control this land? Who should decide its future? And perhaps the most dangerous question of all: what happens when people stop obeying their king? I didn't know it yet, but those questions were about to ignite a fire that would spread far beyond a single colony. And once the first sparks appeared, there would be no turning back. The tension didn't explode overnight. It built slowly, almost quietly, like distant thunder that everyone could hear but no one wanted to acknowledge. At first, the colonies still considered themselves British. Families celebrated the same traditions. Merchants depended on trade with England. Many believed the crown would always protect them. But protection came with a price. After the French and Indian War ended in 1763, Britain found itself drowning in debt. Someone had to pay the bill. The answer, from London's perspective, was obvious. Me. New taxes began appearing one after another: the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts. Each law seemed small on its own, but together they created something much heavier than taxes. They created resentment. I could feel frustration spreading through crowded taverns, busy docks, and dusty village squares. Conversations that once revolved around farming and trade now centered on rights, liberty, and government. One sentence echoed louder every year: no taxation without representation. It wasn't just a slogan. It was a warning. The British government dismissed the complaints, believing stricter control would restore order. Instead, every new restriction pushed the colonies a little closer to rebellion. Then, one cold evening in Boston, anger finally spilled into the streets. A crowd surrounded British soldiers. Shouting became pushing. Pushing became panic. Then came the gunfire. When the smoke cleared, several colonists lay dead. The Boston Massacre became more than a tragic confrontation. It became a symbol. Suddenly, pamphlets spread faster than official announcements. Newspapers fueled outrage. Ordinary people began asking themselves whether compromise was still possible. For a while, it was. Or at least they hoped so. But in 1773, another spark landed on dry ground: the Tea Act. To many colonists, it wasn't really about tea. It was about control. On a freezing December night, men disguised themselves as Mohawk warriors climbed aboard British ships anchored in Boston Harbor. One crate after another crashed into the dark water until hundreds of chests of tea floated across the harbor. The Boston Tea Party lasted only a few hours. Its consequences would last forever. Britain answered with punishment. Ports closed. Local governments lost authority. British troops increased their presence. The so-called intolerable acts were meant to break colonial resistance. Instead, they united it. For the first time, representatives from different colonies gathered together to discuss a shared future. They still hoped reconciliation might be possible, but every meeting revealed the same uncomfortable truth. Neither side wanted to surrender. Then came April 19th, 1775. Lexington. Conquered. No one knows with certainty who fired the first shot, but everyone remembers what happened next. The shot heard around the world echoed far beyond a single battlefield. Farmers grabbed old muskets, blacksmiths became soldiers, teachers, merchants, craftsmen, and laborers suddenly found themselves marching toward war against the most powerful empire on earth. Many believed the rebellion would be crushed within months. Britain certainly did. After all, it possessed the world's greatest navy, experienced generals, and professional armies. The colonies had courage, but courage alone rarely wins wars. Then I watched a quiet man step forward. George Washington accepted command of the Continental Army. He wasn't handed a perfect force. Far from it. His soldiers often lacked uniforms. Many had no proper boots. Food was scarce. Gunpowder ran low. Desertions became common. Disease spread through overcrowded camps faster than enemy bullets. Winter became another enemy. At Valley Forge, freezing temperatures punished every mistake. Snow covered the camps. Men wrapped bleeding feet in scraps of cloth because they had nothing else. Some nights, I wondered whether the revolution would simply freeze to death. Yet something remarkable happened. The army endured, not because conditions improved overnight, they didn't, but discipline slowly replaced chaos. Training transformed volunteers into soldiers. Hope survived another winter. Then, unexpectedly, help arrived from across the Atlantic. France. Britain's longtime rival recognized an opportunity after the American victory at Saratoga. French money, supplies, soldiers, and naval power dramatically shifted the balance. The war was no longer a colonial rebellion. It had become an international conflict. Battles stretched across years. Families were divided. Neighbors sometimes fought on opposite sides. Entire communities struggled to survive while armies marched back and forth across the countryside. Victory still felt uncertain. Every triumph seemed followed by another setback. Every celebration carried fresh grief. Finally, in 1781, everything converged at Yorktown. British General Cornwallis found himself trapped. American forces surrounded him on land. French warships sealed the sea. Escape became impossible. As the siege tightened, I could almost feel history holding its breath. Would the British surrender? Or would one final battle decide whether this fragile dream of independence lived or died? Days passed in unbearable tension. Every cannon blast shook the ground beneath me. Smoke drifted across the fields from sunrise until nightfall, and each explosion carried the weight of a future that had not yet been written. Soldiers waited behind earthen walls, exhausted but determined. Food was running low. Ammunition was precious. No one knew who would break first. Then it happened. On October 19, 1781, British General Cornwallis surrendered at Yorktown. The fighting did not end everywhere that same day, but the outcome was clear. Against impossible odds, 13 colonies had defeated the most powerful empire on earth. The impossible had become reality. A few years later, the Treaty of Paris officially recognized the United States as an independent nation. For the first time, I wasn't simply a collection of colonies. I had become something entirely new. But winning freedom and building a country were two very different challenges. The celebration faded quickly. The new nation was deeply in debt. Its government was weak. Each state had its own priorities, its own economy, and often its own disagreements. There were moments when I wondered if this young republic would collapse before it truly began. Leaders gathered once again, this time not to fight a war, but to write a future. In Philadelphia, they debated for months. Every word mattered. Every compromise carried consequences. Out of those heated discussions came the Constitution, a document designed to balance power between the people and the government. It wasn't perfect, not even close. Many voices were left unheard. Women had few political rights. Native nations were pushed farther from their ancestral lands. And slavery, despite the promise that all men are created equal, remained firmly embedded in the nation's foundation. The contradiction grew larger every year. I could feel it. The country expanded westward at an astonishing pace. New towns appeared where forests had once stood. Roads became turnpikes. Canals connected distant communities. Farmers pushed farther across the frontier, convinced opportunity always lay just beyond the next hill. Then came an invention that changed everything: the cotton gin. What seemed like a simple machine transformed the Southern economy almost overnight. Cotton production exploded. Plantations became larger. Profits soared. But there was a horrifying consequence. Instead of reducing slavery, the demand for enslaved labor increased dramatically. Families were bought and sold. Children were separated from parents. Human lives became commodities. As wealth grew, so did the moral divide between different parts of the country. Meanwhile, another revolution was unfolding in the North. Factories began replacing workshops. Steam engines powered machines that could produce goods faster than ever before. Railroads stretched across the landscape, shrinking distances that had once taken weeks to travel. Cities grew rapidly. Immigrants arrived by the millions from Ireland, Germany, Italy, and countless other places, each carrying hopes for a better future. They built neighborhoods, opened businesses, and added new languages, traditions, and cultures to the growing nation. Yet, opportunity wasn't equally shared. Many newcomers faced discrimination. Workers endured exhausting conditions. Children labored long hours in dangerous factories. Prosperity existed. So did hardship. And while industry transformed one half of the country, another question refused to disappear. Could a nation dedicated to liberty continue allowing slavery? Every new territory entering the Union reopened the debate. Would it permit slavery or prohibit it? Compromises delayed the conflict, but never solved it. The Missouri Compromise. The Compromise of 1850. The Kansas-Nebraska Act. Each agreement acted like a temporary bandage over a wound that continued growing deeper beneath the surface. Then violence erupted in Kansas. Neighbors who once farmed side by side now fought each other over the future of slavery. Newspapers described the territory as Bleeding Kansas, and the name captured exactly what I felt. This wasn't simply a political disagreement anymore. Blood was already being spilled. Then, in 1860, another turning point arrived. Abraham Lincoln was elected president. For many in the North, his election represented hope that slavery's expansion could finally be stopped. For many in the South, it represented something entirely different: a threat. One by one, Southern states announced they would leave the Union. The country I had struggled so hard to build was beginning to tear itself apart from within. Families stood divided. Brothers chose opposite sides. Friends became enemies almost overnight. Every conversation carried uncertainty. Every newspaper seemed darker than the last. I could sense that the greatest test in my history was no longer approaching. It had already begun. And as soldiers gathered at a small fort in Charleston Harbor, the first cannon had not yet fired. But everyone knew that once it did, America would never be the same again. Silence hung over Charleston Harbor like a storm waiting for permission to strike. Then, before dawn on April 12, 1861, the first cannon roared toward Fort Sumter. The Civil War had begun. In an instant, every disagreement that had been postponed for decades erupted into open conflict. The Union fought to preserve the nation. The Confederacy fought for independence and the continuation of a system built upon slavery. What many believed would be a short war became 4 years of unimaginable destruction. I watched battlefields stretch from Virginia to Mississippi. I saw fields that had once produced crops become places of unimaginable loss. Families waited months for letters that never arrived. Entire towns mourned together as casualty lists grew longer with every passing battle. More than 600,000 lives were lost. The cost was almost beyond comprehension. Yet, even in the middle of the darkness, history refused to stand still. In 1863, Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. It did not instantly free every enslaved person, but it transformed the purpose of the war. The struggle was no longer only about preserving the Union. It had become a fight against slavery itself. 2 years later, the war finally ended. The Union survived. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery across the United States, ending an institution that had shaped the nation since its earliest colonial days. Freedom had expanded. Equality, however, remained unfinished. The years that followed were filled with rebuilding, political conflict, and new struggles over civil rights. Reconstruction brought hope to many, but it also sparked fierce resistance. Progress often came one step forward and 2 steps back. Still, the nation continued to grow. Railroads linked the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. Telegraph wires carried messages across thousands of miles in moments instead of weeks. New inventions transformed everyday life. The telephone allowed distant voices to meet. Electric lights pushed back the darkness. Factories multiplied, and America's cities expanded into bustling centers of industry. By the beginning of the 20th century, I was changing faster than ever before. Millions of immigrants arrived through places like Ellis Island, carrying little more than dreams and determination. They built neighborhoods, opened businesses, worked in mines, factories, and rail yards, helping shape a nation that was becoming increasingly diverse. Then the world itself descended into war. During World War I, American soldiers crossed the Atlantic to fight in Europe. Although the conflict was devastating, an even greater challenge soon emerged at home: the Great Depression. In 1929, the stock market crashed. Banks failed. Businesses closed. Millions of people lost their jobs. Families stood in breadlines, uncertain where their next meal would come from. Farmers watched dust storms swallow entire fields during the Dust Bowl. Once again, resilience was tested. Recovery had barely begun when another global conflict arrived. World War II changed everything. After the attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941, the United States entered the war with full force. Factories shifted to wartime production almost overnight. Men and women served across Europe, Africa, and the Pacific. Scientific breakthroughs accelerated at an astonishing pace, culminating in the development of the atomic bomb. When the war ended in 1945, the United States emerged as one of the world's leading powers. But peace brought new tensions. The Cold War began. For decades, fear of nuclear conflict shaped politics, science, and everyday life. The space race inspired extraordinary achievements, and in 1969, millions watched as human beings walked on the moon for the first time. At the same time, another battle was unfolding within the nation. The civil rights movement challenged segregation and racial injustice that had persisted long after slavery ended. Ordinary citizens marched, protested, and demanded equal treatment under the law. Landmark legislation expanded civil rights, but the pursuit of equality continued beyond those victories. As the 20th century gave way to the 21st, technology transformed the way people lived. Computers entered homes, the internet connected continents. Smartphones placed the world's knowledge into the palm of a hand. America experienced extraordinary innovation while also facing new tests. The attacks of September 11, 2001 reminded the nation that tragedy could arrive without warning. Wars overseas, Economic recessions, political polarization, and a global pandemic challenged every generation in different ways. Yet through every triumph and every hardship, one pattern remained remarkably consistent. I was never a finished story. Every generation inherited both remarkable achievements and unresolved challenges. Every era celebrated progress while confronting new questions. Freedom expanded, but so did the responsibility to protect it. Innovation created opportunities, but also demanded wisdom in how those opportunities were used. Looking back across more than 4 centuries, my journey has never been a straight line. It has been shaped by courage and contradiction, by hope and heartbreak, by visionaries who imagined a better future and ordinary people who sacrificed to make that future possible. I have witnessed exploration and revolution, expansion and division, civil war and reconciliation, depression and prosperity, discovery and uncertainty. Every chapter has added another layer to the nation that exists today. And perhaps the most remarkable truth is this: